Okay, if you're in one of the A classes, you're watching this. B classes, you don't need to watch this one. We are going to continue on and try to get you guys in a spot where you can take your test on the first day of next week rather than having to come in on Thursday and Friday. So we're going to look at the Spanish-American War. I'm going to do this in two videos. We're going to be about 10 minutes each. We're going to probably look at about 15 slides total. All right, so I can't remember to wait for the annoying noise to end. So one of the things you guys need to understand is that Cuba is located about 90 miles off the coast of Florida. You could swim it if you weren't afraid of sharks. You'd probably die, so don't try it. Usually anybody who does is accompanied by boats with harpoon guns and stuff like that. But you guys need to understand a little bit about the relationship between Spain and Cuba. For a really very long time in the history of this world, Spain was a very major country, and Cuba had been its very loyal colony. Spain was on the decline at this point in history and had lost a great deal of its possessions around the world and was starting to see its time as a world power coming to an end. But Cuba had been kind of its faithful colony. They had used it for sugar and other fruits, and it was a pretty consistent money supply for them. And so while the United States was involved in that Venezuelan boundary dispute from the last presentation, a civil war broke out where the Cubans decided to fight for their independence. There had been a small revolution before this that had lasted about 10 years, but it had failed miserably. And so the Spaniards had lost trust in the Cubans and now decided that they were going to be really harsh to them. So this civil war that broke out was really kind of a second attempt at the Cubans trying to get their independence, much like we tried to get our independence from the British in 1776. Now, the second revolution started in 1895, and Cuban patriots decided that the time was right to fight for their independence because they thought Spain was in a weak place. The Cubans decided after their loss in 1868 that they couldn't take the Spaniards on toe-to-toe. That wasn't exactly a smart way for them to do things. So they started to use guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrilla warfare is a method basically that's like seek and destroy, hit and run, where a small number of soldiers could attack a large number of soldiers and then disappear. Guerrilla warfare basically is based upon surprise and that you know the territory better than your opponent. Some of the methods that that the Cubans used against the Spaniards were burning their own sugar fields. Now, if you're wondering why they would do that, that's why the Cubans were needed. Sugar was a money supply for the Spaniards, so by burning those fields, they were burning what was needed. The Cubans also blocked their own railroads. This caused the Spaniards to have to march through the jungles instead of using the rail system and open them up to attacks. They also ambushed Spanish soldiers. If you don't know what the word ambush is, that's a secret attack. So by late 1896, the Cubans controlled the countryside. They had a hard time taking over the cities because the Spaniards had toeholds in those cities that made them pretty hard to knock out. The Cubans were led by a guy named Jose Marti. Now, Marti is kind of a unique revolutionary. He was a writer and a statesman. He was actually in the United States when this broke out, attempting to get support from Americans for the Cubans. He'd been a pretty heavy critic of Spanish rule and written in American newspapers about the atrocities or bad things the Spaniards had done to the Cubans. When the fighting started, Marti returned to Cuba. He was actually killed 4 days into the fighting, so it didn't last very long. Marti is considered a martyr by the Cuban people, or someone who died for an important cause, and he's credited with much of Cuba's fight for independence. A lot of people give him a lot of credit because he got a lot of support for the war in the United States and started to make the Americans sympathetic towards the Cubans' cause. He compared Cuba to the United States and our revolution against the British. Once this revolution really broke out, Spain decided that they wanted to get control of the countryside again, that they wanted to control Cuba and be able to reestablish their sugar fields. And so they sent a man named Valeriano Weyler, whose nickname was the Butcher, to Cuba to regain control. And what he did was he started something called reconcentrados, or basically loosely concentration camps. Oh, the lights went off. That was weird. I'm going to wave my arms and bring them back on. So Weyler went around the countryside and basically said, if you're not a threat, you need to come with us. And they threw them in the camps. If you weren't in a camp, then you were an enemy. This achieved two goals. It allowed the Spaniards to understand exactly who their enemies were because anybody that was on the loose was an enemy. And it also stopped people from supporting the rebels. There was no one to feed them or hide them because they were all in the camps. About 500,000 people were thrown in those camps, and the conditions were very poor. A lot of people died in the camps, and American newspapers got a hold of a number of pictures of the situations inside those camps, and it made Americans even more sympathetic. 500,000 people in the camp, about 200,000 die from diseases and malaria. Malaria is a disease that you can get when you're stung by a mosquito. It causes a ridiculous fever, dehydration, flu-like symptoms, but basically you can die from it. You can still get malaria in the world today, not in the United States really, but you can get it if you go to Africa and some South American countries. So if you ever travel to those places, you'll probably have to get a malaria shot. Most people in the United States sympathize with Cuba's need to be independent, and so the Cubans established these things called juntas in the United States in order to raise money for their war effort. A lot of Americans were willing to sympathize with them, but most really weren't at a point yet where they wanted to go to war. And then problems broke out in Havana. Havana is the capital of Cuba. So the American president at this time is William McKinley, our expansionist, and he wanted to try to persuade Spain to give the Cubans more self-rule, not total independence, but more say over what was going on in their country. This had no effect. The Spaniards didn't feel that they needed to listen to McKinley. So McKinley decided that since there were Americans in Cuba, he wanted to send down a warship to kind of keep an eye on the situation and make sure the Americans in Cuba were safe. So in January of 1898, we sent the USS Maine, a big, basically steel Navy ship down there. It sat for a month and a half and nothing really happened. And then on February 15th, in the middle of the night, the ship mysteriously exploded. 266 American sailors were killed. The captain of the ship begged American newspapers not to overreact, that they didn't know what happened. But the next day, American newspapers published pictures and published cartoons showing the Spaniards blowing the ship up. This increased the tensions between the United States and Spain. Americans called for war with basically the slogan, "Remember the Maine." Years later, however, American divers went down to the scene of the explosion and found out that the boat had actually exploded from inside. See, the design back then was to put the engine room, which had coal in it, next to the ammunition room, which had all the bombs and the gunpowder in it. And those two together caused a horrible explosion. Regardless, a lot of the American public, because of the yellow journalism or exaggerated stories, decided that the Spaniards must be to blame. Now, even though McKinley was an expansionist, he wanted to avoid war. He wanted to end the struggle in Cuba, end the concentration camps, get a truce, and allow the Cubans more self-government. Spain was willing to do this, but the rebels wanted total independence. Spain wasn't willing to give total independence because that would take away their last major territorial control. It would also make them look weak. And in the United States, the hotheads won out, or the war hawks. McKinley knew the Cubans' demands wouldn't be met, and so he offered Spain one last ultimatum. He said that all peaceful means had been exhausted, but he said that if the Spaniards were willing to give that self-rule, the United States wouldn't declare war. Unfortunately, Spain did not do that, and we declared war. Before going to war, we passed something called the Teller Amendment. Now, the Teller Amendment stated that once the war was over, we had no intention of taking over Cuba. This was important because we didn't want to look like we were fighting for selfish means. All right, I'm going to stop this one right now. I know I went pretty fast. Hopefully, you guys were able to pause and get the things that you needed to out of it. And there will be a second video that's going to go over the war itself. It's very quick. The war itself is very fast. So we'll get you on the next one. I hope you guys got this. If you have any questions, just let me know.